Mini episode 1475 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by Sportsology, delivering unconventional columns and webcasts about sports, TV, music, movies, and more. Follow them on the web at sportsology.com.
The FDH Lounge. You'll want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to FDH Lounge mini episode 1475. This is FDH managing partner Rick Morris here. And I have the crew that we had a couple weeks back for previewing the NFL Draft in 2022. FDH Lounge fellow original dignitaries Jason Jones and Chris Galloway. And we're going to be getting into what happened this past weekend here, what we thought might happen, what did happen. It was very, very hard to forecast this. This is the kind of draft, as they say, that is like trying to eat coffee with a fork as far as predicting what's going to happen. And again, my mock draft stands as stark evidence of that. I did get the Kenny Pickens pick right, so give me credit for that. But it was very, very difficult to forecast everything that was going to happen. It was very, very topsy-turvy, and that comes from, and this is going to be the recurring theme of this. This comes from the fact that it was not a particularly deep draft, and you could even question the upside of the best players at some of these different positions. So we'll get into that, and again, we'll bring in first here the man whose rankings and top 150 powered our draft guide, which you can still find on the main page at fantasydrafthelp.com, Pro Football Draftology 2022. Our senior editor, Jason Jones. Jason, good to have you in, my man. Looking forward to breaking this down with you.
Yeah, this was an event. It was very interesting. We'll get into some of the more gritty details, I guess. But one thing I did want to just throw out real quick that I thought was interesting. There was the sense of what was consensus, and that always changes. But when you look at this first round, there were the notion that somebody wasn't going to go before a certain number, and they went before that number. Or there were two guys at one position that one guy was clearly thought it was better, and the other guy was right there. But the second guy got before the first guy.
Yep.
So that should have been some indication that every team was going to have their own version of this because of the lack of depth.
Yeah, and it was a real value be damned kind of a situation because it was very, very hard to trade down in this draft. It was exceedingly difficult to do so, and we'll be getting into that and much more with the other member of the booth here, the other hardy perennial of our NFL draft coverage, fellow original lounge dignitary, my good pal from way back when, Chris Galloway. Chris, good to have you on, my man. I know you have some distinct thoughts on what we just saw.
Rick, good to be with you as always. And, I thought it was an interesting draft from an overall sense of the amount of trading I thought sort of verified my suspicion about the 2022 draft and the 2023 draft. And I can get into that specifically as we walk through the show.
I think so. I know we're a little bit of where you're going to go with that, and that is definitely something we need to talk about vis-a-vis strength of the various draft classes. What I want to mention also here, our other guide that we recommend that you check out, and it's going to be a massive part of our discussion here, available also on the main page at fantasydrafthelp.com, the 2022 FDH post-draft NFL rankings. And we have a couple of different categories here, as well as updated power rankings for next season, and a list of remaining needs for each team coming out of the draft. But the three categories for ranking the draft, just the value of players taken based on the top 150. So how did teams do in terms of getting the best players? That's just a raw number right there. And we have another metric that is based half on that and half what teams did to fill their needs. And then there is just one word, is nothing but assessing teams filling their needs. And it doesn't really take anything with the top 150 into account. It's just a matter of what was the different percentages of needs filled. So in terms of going through this, I'll just give the top 10 and the bottom 10 in each category here. For the top 10 in value, number 1, Baltimore with 805. I mean, it was massive how much they were ahead of the next team there. Number 2, the New York Jets at 625. From there, the rest of the top 10. Green Bay 596, Houston 581, Kansas City 565, Seattle 534, Jacksonville 480, Tennessee 475, Detroit 468, and Indianapolis 410. The bottom 10 in the category drop all the way down to Tampa Bay 264, Chicago 241, Buffalo 229, Cleveland 222, Las Vegas 165, San Francisco 130, Denver 127, New England 107, LA Rams 21, the Miami Dolphins 15. Whoops! As far as the value and needs metric, the 50-50. Number 1, Baltimore 1544, once again towering over the rest of the field because Kansas City is 2 at 1365, a very strong number, ahead of 3, Houston 1281. Then from there, Green Bay 1221, Seattle at 1184, Dallas at 1125, New York Jets 1075, Indianapolis 1038, Cleveland 1022, Philadelphia 1012. Drop down to the bottom 10 here. Pittsburgh at 559, Las Vegas 515, Washington 478, Cincinnati 461, New England 457, Denver 427, LA Chargers 414, San Francisco 280, and then the same two teams at the bottom as the other category, LA Rams 71, Miami 65. And then percentage of needs filled. Cleveland and Kansas City did what nobody did last year, filled 100% of their needs, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. Number 3, Baltimore at 86%, and then from there, Dallas at 80%, Houston 58%, Carolina 57%, Seattle 56%, and then a big tie for 8th place. Atlanta, Indianapolis, Philadelphia, Arizona, Buffalo, Tampa Bay, and Green Bay at 50%. Not a big surprise. 50% is kind of an easy number to land on. You drop down to, let's call it a tie for 24th place. Let's start there on the bottom end. Detroit and Pittsburgh at 29%, Cincinnati 25%, tie for 27th place, Washington and San Francisco at 17%. The LA Chargers and Tennessee tied at 13%. Miami and the LA Rams 0%. Did not fill any of their needs. Just a quick note here on some editorial discretion in the process here. It wasn't used in the case of Miami, but I want to explain why. They used a 3rd-round pick on a linebacker, but it wasn't in the top 50. We're not crediting them because there wasn't value with the pick, which it pains me to say, I have to say. Toward the top, Cleveland, 100%. We didn't have any kickers in the top 150. We never do, but I'm giving Cleveland credit for that because they're the only team where I had kicker listed as being a stark need, and they filled it with the best kicker in the draft. So even though it goes outside of the top 150, they'd filled their other 3 needs first. I'm giving the Browns credit on that one. So we'll start here with Jason, just on the overall numbers here as far as how they coincide with how you saw the winners and the losers.
Before we jump into that, I think I want to jump in real fast and just say, again, because percentage of needs filled, 100, 86, 80, 58.
Yeah.
Just let's hold on to that. That's important. We'll see it throughout. Obviously, Baltimore goes without saying. Baltimore, and I could feel it. By the time they picked the center, Linderbaum, in middle of the first, I almost texted you, Rick, to say it's going to be bad because Baltimore's already scoring so exceedingly high with Hamilton falling as he did. And most of their draft is really, really solid. Again, the Jets really great. Kansas City had some surprises with some really good value. And then when we jump down, especially towards the bottom, this is just confirming a theory I have. I think there were some teams that just, where they were picking, maybe they just didn't like what they were looking at and just kind of went off book a little bit. Miami, the Rams, listen, we all know Belichick is a genius. And the first time he did this, it was with Gerard Mayo almost 20 years ago. He's made a habit and a career of doing this. But when he went close range in the first round, I literally fell out of my chair. So there are absolutely teams in here that kind of threw caution to the wind when it came to value and just found guys, maybe situationally or schematically, that just really fit what they want to do and said, damn the value. So my overall take on it is, yeah, the numbers ended up playing this out relatively accurately. The one exception, or a handful of exceptions, I would say, is in general, not analytically, just on the surface, I like some of what Detroit did, New York Jets specifically. I think the Saints had a couple picks. I think Pittsburgh flat out wet the bed. And then yet you still have some teams in here like Buffalo. An argument could be made for Arizona that I kind of like. And then I look at the Chargers, who are right in the middle, and I absolutely hate their draft. So there's some subjectivity to that, but if you're looking at just the numbers predicted this before we even saw the commissioner on stage.
That's true. And I want to make this point here because last year was the first year that we had incorporated percentage of team needs filled into our post-draft analysis. And I wish I had thought of this for previous years because it's one of the biggest drums I've been beating as somebody that was a long-suffering Browns fan. A phrase that I have used. It's now funny when I hear some of my friends echoing my phrase back to me, criticizing teams. I love hearing that, being the egotist that I am. Create a hole, fill a hole. It was something that the Browns would excel at. They'd cut their best linebacker and then use their first-round pick on a linebacker and act like they made the team better. But as far as filling needs, last year, this jumps off the page at me. Who was number one at 67% last year, so teams were less successful. Number one last year at 67% was Cincinnati. Now, clearly the offensive line accounted for the rest of the 33%, but teams that did well last year, Dallas at 50%, Kansas City 50, San Francisco 50, Arizona 40. That was a tie for sixth, by the way. And there's exceptions to the rule, yes, but you look at the bottom, and an exception to the rule in 30th place last year was Buffalo, with only 11%. Well, that didn't hobble them like I thought it would. But the two teams at zero last year were Houston and Seattle. So that should be a little bit of a flashing red light to the Rams and Miami. I know that the Rams are very arrogant about the draft and think that they can do it all through other means. But, you look at how this went last year, and it didn't correlate perfectly to what teams did. The Browns, for example, were tied for second last year at 50%. And you can make the sad trombone sound for what their season ended up like. But it definitely is something we should keep an eye on here. Teams that did the best job of filling their needs. And like I said, we had 4 teams score above the high from last year. Cincinnati at 67%. Again, Cleveland and KC at 100, Baltimore at 86, Dallas at 80. So, Chris, on the totality here of the numbers, and it's a big numbers soup that I've been spitting out the last couple of minutes here, but the things that really jump out the most and that coincided most with what you were observing at the time?
Well, first I want to say I've always appreciated the approach that FDH has taken to analyzing the draft and trying to be very analytical.
Thank you.
In terms of assigning concrete data points and scoring to players beforehand and then ranking them and now putting in the remaining needs percentages as part of that equation, I think was a great next variant to add to the equation.
Appreciate it.
It always, the effort you put into this, I have always laughed at the fact that for a long time you would really, really shit on analytics and football, and yet you apply them like some sort of a scientist yourself with your beakers and goggles and whatnot. So I've always appreciated the approach. I think it makes the rankings that FDH does far superior than the ones that most just random Main Street sports sites do, where they just throw a letter on based on, 1 or 2 players in a class. All that being said, let me give you some thoughts on how I saw it playing out. We talked about this somewhat before the draft, and I think a lot of us saw the draft this year as a middling class. Jason talked about it as a great opportunity to find role players and players that will fit your system and fill a depth chart so you can find value, but you've got to be strategic about it, and you've got to be very, cautious in how you go about your draft. But his point that he made was there were going to be players, even though the rankings overall that we were assigning to some of these position groups weren't great, there were guys in there that if you run a certain defense, and on third down, he could be a great third down pass rusher in this defense, those types of things. So I think what we saw with the volume of trades going on Thursday through Saturday showed that was right, and that most of these teams viewed this draft as an opportunity to find depth, situational, and scheme guys that could fit what they're trying to do. So, and I think all the moving up and moving down, and you saw just so many trades that I think that was evidence of how these teams viewed it as well. And using somebody like the Browns, it screamed to me that Andrew Berry viewed this draft the same way. I think the player he wanted at 44 wasn't there, and he had no hesitation to bail out and executed that variation of his plan. You saw other teams do it. New England clearly, I think, felt the same way as well. I don't like some of the picks they made, but they treated the draft very similarly. On the same side, a lot of people think 2023 is going to be a much stronger class, and you saw teams, I think the smart teams, of course, trying to add draft picks for 2023, giving up picks this year for next year, hoarding picks. So we saw that with a lot of teams. And so I think that also solidified that, like we think, next year the teams agree that the draft class top to bottom is going to be deeper and have more talent. So they're moving back. But there are some teams that did very, very well this past weekend. The one that jumps out to me is the Jets. I just love what they did. They were aggressive, and I thought that they went out and they got players that a lot of folks had at the top of their boards in all these position groups, whether it's Sauce Gardner, Garrett Wilson. Some people thought Jermaine Johnson was a top 2 or 3 edge rusher. Some people had Breece Hall as a top running back. Jeremy Ruckert with great potential. I just loved what the Jets did. I have no fault in it. A team that had a lot of needs, and they went out and they attacked them, and they got some really talented guys. Unfortunately, of course, as is always the case, we saw Baltimore do a great job. Jason talked about that. I sit there and dread during these drafts and just watch Ravens year after year just draft so smartly. I hate it. But getting Kyle Hamilton at 14, getting Linderbaum at 25, Ojabo, a prospect for edge rush, he's going to come back in the second half of the season. Travis Jones, the defensive tackle. They went on and on and on and on and on. All these guys that I kept going, oh man, they're just adding talent and depth. Like Baltimore, year after year after year, just never failed. And again, eyeball test, it's always interesting to me how the eyeball test fits with your rankings, Rick, because, I thought Kansas City also had a great draft. And, you've got them right up there at the top. The same thing with Baltimore. Again, my eyeball test told me great draft for those teams. I thought Cleveland was, kind of a B, but I thought what they did do in terms of David Bell and Winfrey, I thought were great picks. And I was a huge fan of the kicker pick. I know a lot of experts were sort of poo-pooing that. How can you take a kicker in the 4th round? Well, when you have the worst kicking game last year and you desperately need a kicker, getting a kicker at the end of the 4th round is not exactly some outrageous thing. That guy's going to be responsible for how many points,
Right.
how many game on the line situations.
Definitely.
It's easy to say don't draft a kicker, but the fact is they are responsible for a lot of points every Sunday and responsible for a lot of success. The first time that kid, Cade York, goes and wins the Browns a game like he did at Florida in 2020 in the fog, 57 yards out, Browns fans would be like, oh, that's why you draft a kicker.
Right.
And you want to know what, for the fans that say, oh, well, they've done this before and it always fails. Then you know what you do if it fails again? Next year you draft another damn kicker until you get it right.
Right.
We do that with every other position. Well, he's not working out at tackle. Let's go get another tackle. Why wouldn't you do that with kicker? Kicker seems to be the only position that people are like, well, you tried it once, never do it again. Well, I mean, that's just dumb. So, I as a fan, I'm happy with what the Browns did. Again, I liked what the Jets did a lot. I know your ranking had them very low, and I suspect that that's mostly based on need. I think I love the players that they picked.
Right.
And your value had them second. So, I think there were a number of teams. It's funny. I commented on my buddy we were watching the draft together. I said, is it just me, or I think teams are getting smarter overall about drafting and their process. And that tells me that analytics have really seeped into a lot of organizations because they all seem, all picks don't work out, obviously, but what they're doing and where they're doing it and the value, they seem to be getting smarter and smarter about it. The sort of John Dorsey shoot from the hip, old school, good bow, it seems to be fading. And the Andrew Berry approach seems to be ascending.
I agree with that, and I will say this. In terms of analytics, just to clarify something before here, I'm critical of analytics occupying too big a part of the space. I've always believed in it as a tool and smartly to be used. I'm going to start with something here. I'm going to start with you on this one, Chris. I alluded to this off here. There's a little bit of a philosophical thing, speaking of the poster child for analytics here, Andrew Berry and the Cleveland Browns. And in terms of the draft this year, and there are two specific schools of thought. And I know that you are of the school of thought of trust Andrew Berry based on the way the drafts have gone the last 2 years. I do want to point out two key differentials from the last two drafts to this one, which is, remember, the last two drafts that he did were very popular in real time. This year, not so much. But again, the public was at least smart enough to be able to discern bad drafts in real time, as they so often had the 20 years previously. Many of those were unpopular at the very moment. And so that as a metric here, I think cannot completely be discounted in terms of trust Andrew Berry. Well, he was doing the popular things, and the popular things worked the last 2 years. This year, a little less popularity. So I think it's way more of a wait-and-see kind of a thing rather than, well, he was successful the last 2 years, believe in it this year. The other thing being, too, another criticism that I'd made during that 20-year span was never planting the flag for this year. And yes, it might sound weird to say that because the Browns did fulfill all of their needs, albeit certainly not with some of the players I would have done if I were in that position. But as far as what you're saying about trading back picks for next year, everything like that, I thought the entire point of everything the Browns have been doing is that the future is now. They're going for a Super Bowl now. And again, it's not really compromising it that much, but I'm just saying it's a little bit reminiscent of how past regimes had done it, thinking more of next year and the year after. The last 2 years, there wasn't a whole lot of wait for next year in this. And this year, there was a little bit more of that. So the two counterpoints that I want to give you philosophically to what the Browns did, I'll let you guys both react, but I want to hear from you first, Chris, because I think I know where you're going to go with this, but you didn't know what my question was going to be. So I just want to hear off the top of your head your reaction to that.
Well, I just, in the classic SNL point-counterpoint skit, Rick, you ignorant slut. No, in all seriousness, I get what you're saying, but I think where you're drafting dictates some of that. I don't think Andrew Berry fell back just to fall back, okay? I think where he probably had players ranked, it did not make sense to stick in 44 if he wasn't getting the guy he wanted. Now, I wanted, George Pickens.
Me too.
He clearly decided, nope, I don't want him. He decided he didn't like him, right? For whatever reason, he wasn't his value there. Where he was clearly on Andrew's board, he decided to bail out on that. So again, not privy to their board. But I think also you talk about winning now, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Browns are in a win now mode, okay? there's nobody that thought, even if they kept their 44th pick, that the 44th pick is a make or break for this team in terms of Super Bowl contention. So from that standpoint, I get what you're saying. This isn't the fourth pick expected to come in and start. The 44th pick is like probably should start, but maybe even the second half of the year because it's a second rounder. You know, I think where you're drafting helps to determine what your strategy may also be in those situations. So, and Andrew Berry's always preaching, you know, we have our perspective, which he's always said, you know, we're always balancing, right? We're always getting players in for development in the pipeline for the future. We're trying to win now, but we're also trying to, you know, we're not selling out now for the future. We're always trying to have a balance. He says that repeatedly. At some point, we probably ought to listen to that and realize that's how he's going to approach it. But as far as their draft goes, I mean, I love the Alex Wright pick because I think in a couple of years that guy could be the real deal to pair up with Myles Garrett. I mean, I liked it. He's a developmental guy, but man, I'm like, there's some real potential there. I think David Bell's going to play a lot this year, okay? And obviously Cade York is, and I think Winfrey's going to get into rotation this year. So they got guys that are going to play. But for the Browns, really, even though we are in win now, it was depth. It's depth. It was depth and future development was clearly on tap for this year. It was obvious going into it.
Okay, I knew you would have some interesting philosophical points on that. Jason, want to get your thoughts as well as I know we had talked off air, and you have some specific thoughts on where Andrew Berry might have deviated from the conventional wisdom in terms of some of the picks that he made.
Yeah, I absolutely love how how Chris will just set these up for me so beautifully. So you ready for me to connect the two of you?
Sure.
You're both right, and here's why. Martin Emerson, and I'm just using the Browns as a case study. I think you can make the argument for probably 75% of the league is approaching it in some sort of applied way.
Mm-hmm.
I honestly don't know what Washington and the Chargers are doing, but it's a different story. I think that Emerson, the DB, was specifically picked to replace Hill. I think he's going to be the nickel corner for the most part.
Okay.
I think we're going to see him a lot in blitz packages, and he's going to hug the line because, as I told you, I watch him on tape now that he's been picked from the lens of what they're looking for, and I see JOK as a DB in him like crazy, and that one feels like a schematic, beautiful pick that I completely understand. Alex Wright, since Chris brought him up, I think he's absolutely going to get the mix, but I think they also go into that pick knowing he's not the player they expect him to eventually become. He's not your defensive end you're going to line up opposite Myles Garrett on most downs. However, they do have a package that they've made jokes about in press conferences before, where if we assume Clowney comes back, where you could feasibly see this finally working, where you go Garrett, Winfrey, Wright, Clowney, where you basically have four guys on the defensive line, all of which are trying to get to the quarterback, but the defensive tackles are stout enough that they can hold it if they check down to a run or something. David Bell, I absolutely agree. I think you can pencil him in right now. If they don't sign another receiver, you can pencil him right now at wide receiver 2. And yes, I'm fast forwarding through training camp. But I honestly think when you put the tape on, he is such a perfect complement to what Cooper's going to bring that he's going to play a lot. Perrion Winfrey, I absolutely love it. I think that's perfect. Cade, we've talked about. Now, Jerome Ford, the Cincinnati running back, I absolutely believe is the Ernest Johnson insurance. We cannot keep him as a running back free forever. That guy needs to be a split back or a featured back somewhere. He's that good. And that just speaks to what Barry's been doing this whole time. And he's anticipating moves, getting guys that can fill gaps so that we don't have holes. And he's done that by, I honestly believe that at some point that factored into the Newsom pick last year. So you can look at this and say, yeah, is Michael Woods and Deshaun Deaton developmental players? Probably. Isaiah Thomas, he could even get into the mix if he makes the team. The point here is, all of these picks follow a different sort of pattern, and I think that while, yes, there is something to be had in this draft, and yes, there is capital to be gained for next year's draft, I think that he went in saying we're going to get players that will contribute to us competing now, even though they're very situational, in the hopes they become something bigger later. But I think if I had to put sort of a bottom line on it, I am leaning towards Barry kind of knew what he was doing and just kind of looked at the board and said, guess what, guys? I don't like Christian Watson. I don't like that he's old. I don't like that he's raw. I don't like Treylon Burks for all the reasons I've been saying this whole time. There were just players that just were not on the board. And we have to accept that he's not looking at it from the perspective of here's the top 25 players at that position. Let's just go down the rank. He's saying there's only a few guys in that mix that I even like at all. And if they're not there, I'm going to back up and make sure I have assets to get the guys I know are going to be there a little bit later. So I think it's a little bit of both. But I do think that, I guess to some degree, Barry and other GMs like him have earned some degree of I'll trust you to some extent. But, there were real A-plus blue-chip players in this draft, and they were available 44, and he backed out. I'd have questions. I just don't see any of those guys in this draft. So I'm perfectly fine with what they did. And like I said, this extends to other teams as well. We can cite the New Englands of the world or even what the Jets and Philly did, being a little bit more aggressive. But across the board, there's just so many examples of how there were no straight blue chippers in this. So he did what he thought the analytics or his scouting department thought was best. And I'm okay with that.
Well, very interesting perspectives. And again, the Browns, just the hometown team here for all of us North Coasters, just happened to be an interesting case study in terms of the philosophy of the draft this year. I want to ask you two guys also, too, on some of the macro stories of the draft. Not so much team-oriented, but just in terms of some of the players involved. I mean, one of the interesting things for me is, and I had the immediate reaction, and I must applaud you, Jason, for getting this right on your mock draft, that Trayvon Walker would actually go first overall from Georgia, super talented player, but one of the thinnest resumes of a number one overall player. I kept saying shades of Eric Fisher in 2013 as far as a real head-scratcher for number one. Or if you want to really be mean, Anthony Bennett in 2013 in another sport. But again, that was kind of a weird thing here, and that teams at quarterback were even smarter than I expected they would be, because I had Malik Willis going 6 to Carolina, and they didn't do that. Props to you for not doing that, Jason. But Kenny Pickett going 20 to the Steelers, that seemed pretty obvious to a lot of people. That is the one that did end up happening. The other quarterbacks fell to where they deserved to fall, because outside of Pickett, you really have to squint to see these guys as starters, certainly immediately, and maybe even down the road, at least high-level starters, which is what the best quarterbacks in the draft are supposed to be. So on either these or any other subjects of notable players that rose or fell, take it away, Jason.
Real quick, I did want to jump back because one of the areas we were talking about leading into this was receiver. And as we talked about it in the pre-show, I think there's a lot of things that we liked about a lot of players. Receivers. You can make the argument for quarterbacks, but I think it's harder. Defensive ends, defensive backs. There were a lot of areas that we thought had really good concentration. And one of the areas, you guys mentioned George Pickens earlier.
Yep.
While during the draft, I was actually going back and forth with a friend of ours from the Pizzle, the Club Pizzle podcast.
Oh, Don Peterson. I'm actually going to be on there plugging the top 75 players in pro basketball history sometime soon. So great to hear Don's name mentioned.
Yeah. So if you get a chance, check out Club Pizzle real quick. But we were going back and forth on George Pickens. He was thinking George Pickens by the time we were at like pick 25 for 44. And I didn't get there until Christian Watson came off the board. And then it was this big urgent thing. Like, you got to get him. He's the last one before the tier break. And the more I thought about it after the fact, he looks the part, but there's so much maturity drama there that I'm not surprised if we were to find out he wasn't even on Barry's board. I did want to just jump around real quick if we could, though, highlight a few of these. Kayvon Thibodeau, I think, is going to be fun to come back and look at.
Yep.
I'm not necessarily saying the Giants were necessarily the best place to go, but I'm glad that he went where he went. The Trayvon Walker thing, I mean, that's fun because you kind of have to I just looked at it and said, I think Hayes is too boring for Jacksonville for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
And there was some chatter that they were falling in love with his upside. And whenever that happens, depending on ownership, it's almost a given. They're just going to go with, like, the hot pick, whatever's sexy at the time. So, yeah, I changed that, I believe, a week before and kind of rode with it. But let's take a moment on quarterback real quick, because I'm going to say something now that's kind of shocking. I was less vocal about Willis than I probably should have trusted myself to be.
Mm-hmm.
But with everyone else in the country just clamoring about how great he's going to be, I thought I was the only person in the civilized world watching his tape going, is anybody else seeing this? Like, can he throw it a mile? Yes, but so can Jamarcus Russell. Can he run? Yes, but he's a one-read and run-it quarterback. He has as many bad throws as he has good ones. He has in-game decisions that are just mind-blowing. Almost like, who are you throwing to kind of decisions. So his fall felt realistically perfect to me. And I think had Pittsburgh not taken Pickett, I don't think he would have gone in the first round. I think we need to really seriously brace ourselves for the possibility that what I've been saying this whole time might actually be true. There might not be a single quarterback in this entire draft class that projects as a better prospect than Sam Darnold. So don't be surprised at what happened. Don't look at this and say, oh, my God, everybody passed on quarterback. What's wrong with them? When the entire league looks at the entire position group and goes, yeah, nah, pass, chances are there's something to that. And, again, the last thing I'll say about anybody with specifics, I thought it was interesting that Sauce Gardner was the popular corner at the top, but Stingley went first. And yet, there's a part of me that says, well, that makes sense because you're talking about technician versus, ball hawk athletic guy. But you can also make that argument for a number of other position groups. And that whole dynamic of Stingley over Sauce Gardner or where Karlaftis fell to, which I know is in range, but I did think that there was somebody in there I thought was going to go after he did. The linebacker situation in general was very fluid, and I think there was an idea that if you need linebacker, any one of the top five would have been fine, yet you have Green Bay thinking they need to take Quay Walker in the first round. So there was a lot of, little shuffling of here's what everyone seems to believe is true, and then there'd be, one little outlier at the top telling me that nobody had a consensus understanding of where any of these guys fit. The Devontae Wyatt slide, if you want to call it that, I kind of predicted it, but I thought it would go farther than it did. But by and large, to Chris's previous point, which I guess is kind of my previous point to that, is that this was never going to be the draft where you're going to get your Peyton Mannings or your Patrick Petersons, those perfect prospects that are can't-miss prospects. I don't know that there's not a single can't-miss prospect in this entire draft from one on down. So we can look at this and get kind of nitpicky about it, but at the end of the day, I think a lot of teams got better, but they got better in very specific ways, and none of those ways were by drafting the face of their franchise.
Very well said. A couple points there. On the Trayvon Walker thing, that is, especially as far as upside, that would have been influenced heavily by their head of analytics, Tony Khan, better known these days, and he also works for his father's English Premier League soccer team, but better known these days for the amazing, wonderful AEW promotion seen weekly on TNT and TBS, and he's a genius as a wrestling promoter. But on some of these things with their analytics, a little bit kind of hit and miss. I heard an interview in the fall that was kind of funny. He was promoting when they were doing the Arthur Ashe show, and it was an amazing thing. They fit 20,000 people at Arthur Ashe Stadium. It was quite a spectacle, but he's doing the New York media things there, and they're asking him about the Jaguars, which he didn't want to talk about at that time. But then he just blurts out of nowhere, I'm the guy who discovered James Robinson. And I was like, that's pretty funny to just kind of blurt that out. That was kind of amusing. But yeah, as far as it went here, and I also felt like our friend Russ Cohen, FDH Lounge dignitary and Sportsology proprietor, he owes a fruit basket to Atlanta for reaching on their pick of Drake London, because that probably would have been the Jets at 10. Let's be honest. It wouldn't have been the Jets taking Garrett Wilson if Drake London was still available. So he owes him that. But in terms of looking at this here, oh, and by the way, steal of the draft, Nakobe Dean, I think it was third round to the Eagles. I don't give a crap if there's any medical red flags, whatever. That guy is going to be a stud on that defense. So in this same vein, Chris, any of your thoughts on the specific players rising or falling?
I thought the funniest tweet I saw over the weekend was somebody tweeted out about Dean. They said, either this guy's medicals are far worse than any of us know, or he's a serial killer. Because what is going on?
Right.
The tape doesn't lie on that. My thoughts to Jason's point about the quarterbacks. I none of us liked any of the quarterbacks.
Right.
I like Jason kept questioning myself when people would, they would ooh and ah over Malik Willis, and I'd be like, I don't see it. What am I, the only thing I could, sort of squint my eyes and be like, well, I guess it's 3 years down the road and a lot of amazing development, and you're projecting, but is that what you do with a first-round pick? It's such an important position, and clearly all those teams told us they felt the same way.
Mm-hmm.
None of these quarterbacks were worth the reach. And are they learning? Are they like AI? Like they are learning, like they're starting to get smarter. Like, yes, you need a quarterback, Seattle, but you're not going to reach 3 rounds ahead of where you should draft a quarterback. Or, same thing, Carolina, or Atlanta. You're not going to, it seems like they all stayed within themselves, and I honestly sit there and think, oh my God, they're so learned. They're getting smarter. Thibodeau, Rick, I told you, man. I told you there wouldn't be a slide. I never believed there would be. But he was fifth. He was the fifth pick.
Fifth, okay.
So I mean, that's look, that's not a slide.
Okay.
That's interchangeable on need and whatnot. And then. Yeah, you're right. I hated the Jackson pick by Atlanta. Russ Cohen should be thrilled about that.
Yeah.
But also, a guy I told both of you in the pre-draft show that I love, I had as my number one guy in this draft is Stingley.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I verbally heard you sort of look at me cross-eyed. But I really believe that, 2 years from now, we're going to be looking back on that pick and be like, yeah, that dude's the real deal. And that's not to say the others, others like Thibodeau might not be, great players too. They could be. But I really like Stingley a lot when I watched him on tape. And I had him higher than Sauce Gardner. Because I think the way the league is going, it's moving towards where Stingley is in terms of skill set versus where Gardner is. So that was one that I felt just I when the Texans came up at third, I looked at my buddy. I was watching the draft, and I go, "It's going to be Stingley." He's like, "Stingley? No way!" And I go, "Yep." And boy, they snatched him. So,
Mm-hmm.
There weren't any great surprises. I thought, where I was like, well, other than the Patriots, but honestly, before the Patriots made that pick, my buddy who's a Patriots fan, I famously every year always remind him of the Logan Mankins draft. And I'll never forget that year when we were watching the draft together and they picked the Logan Mankins, and my buddy with outrage just like, who? And I said, I told him, I said, you wait. And I said, this is going to be your Logan Mankins moment. Sure enough, it happened. I mean, he was apoplectic. He was beside himself on Thursday night. I mean, he's like, just cursing Bill Belichick. But, again, I think a lot of these guys, to Jason's point, they went where they went because of team needs, system, and I think the boards were kind of all over the place because of those factors and because there were not clear-cut guys that were to what he said, like the Patrick Petersons or the Jalen Ramseys or these guys that you're like, that guy is, Andrew Luck, like that guy is a surefire thing. There weren't any of those. And so I think boards were kind of all over the place based on what they want to do. So from that standpoint, I guess there just really weren't any real surprises in how this played out.
Well, yeah, I would kind of agree with that. And the last question I want to put to you guys in terms of winners and losers, I want to use this specific prism, and I'm going to use it in the prism of the FDH updated power rankings after the draft here. I'm going to define for these purposes winners and losers by teams that rose or fell in the overall landscape of the draft by what they did. So I'll give you a couple of them from my perspective. The fact I now have Kansas City number 1 because they don't have any more needs to be filled, I think they're a winner. Baltimore coming in at number 3. I sure as heck didn't have them number 3 beforehand. Cleveland, I had it maybe the cusp of the top 10, but I've got them number 7 now at this point because of the kind of draft that they had. And other teams, I think, that moved up. Philadelphia 13. They were a regression candidate, I thought. I thought they were a team that was primed to regress off of last year, a fluke playoff appearance. And again, I've got them as more of a legitimate contender in a super, super thin NFC at this point. Conversely, teams that I have falling based on what happened here, as much as I hate to say it, with the Miami Dolphins ascending from 1A to 1 for me at this point in time here, only number 14 in the power rankings. I felt like neglecting the defense with any kind of impact players with the picks that they had or potential impact players is going to come back to bite them. Now it's a question of not just can Tua get it done with this great talent around him, but can he get it done in order to win, 35 to 31 games? And that's another story altogether. The LA Chargers at 16 overall, they have a lot of needs left. Their offseason's been a head scratcher to me. Tennessee also has a lot of needs. I have them at number 17. Denver at number 18, I felt like missed possibilities to advance here. And to a certain extent, Las Vegas at 19. And these are teams that a lot of people are penciling in that I think are sort of just on the periphery of the playoff chase at this point. By the way, as far as winners go, I got the Jets at 23, and I'd had them probably hovering around 30 before this. So I think that the Jets, relatively speaking, are a winner, as with Houston at 24. But losers in this as well. I think New Orleans continues a very, very messy off season here. I've got them at number 30. I think they're definitely one of the losers of this draft as well. I think a lot of us figured they might be a bad team, but this draft, I think, is just sort of the confirmation 2022 is not going to go their way. So in terms of teams rising or falling on the landscape for next year, based on the job that they did this past weekend, I'll start with you, Jason. Any of your candidates for up or down?
Jacksonville, I don't know what they're doing. I think even though Detroit is relatively low, I think there were some picks that they made that dramatically changed things. I've been a huge fan of Jameson Williams, so I honestly think that's a big splash move. I think they're going to do better. I think we're going to be looking at them at the end of the season power rankings and find them to be sort of in the fringe of that ascending, or they're kind of becoming decent.
Mm-hmm.
They still won't be good yet. Atlanta's a dumpster fire. Houston, I'll be honest, Houston was interesting because they've been this idea ever since Watson stopped playing for them, where you're just like, wow, that is about as bad as a team gets in the NFL. It's ugly, but they are slowly crawling up, which I like. I can't wait for the bubble to burst on Pittsburgh because I'm getting so tired of them just always finding accidental ways to win.
Right.
And I don't think that they necessarily made themselves better.
No.
So that'll either hold or they'll fall from there. I think you're absolutely right about these teams in the middle, the Vegas, the Denvers. You can make an argument for New England under the legacy of Bill Belichick, and then Miami. I think Minnesota did themselves a disservice, and I think Miami just said we're going to get what we like and move on. What's interesting, though, Philly, and I assume we're all giving Philly credit for A.J. Brown.
Yes.
As part of this.
Yes.
But I really like what they did because I think we all would have been in some sort of agreement that this is kind of risky. If they go in and Roseman is just kind of ho-hum the whole time and just kind of picks whatever, then they're in trouble.
but they made some serious moves there that I like. And then, well, I don't love everything the Colts did. They did get better. And then everybody at the top of the list, obviously, got better with the exception of the Rams, just because, again, I think they're another candidate where they said, I don't like what I'm looking at, and I'm just going to pick what I like.
Well, and the thing with Philly is that, and I've made this comment before on the show, Howie Roseman is the J.R. Smith of general managers. I mean, there are moments where he is like J.R. Smith in Game 1 of the 2018 NBA Finals at the end, and there are games where he is like the J.R. Smith of Game 7 of the 2016 NBA Finals when he scored like 7 points in a row in the second half to bring the Cavs back. I mean, you love him or you hate him. I'm not sure we've seen an executive in any sport who goes through these highs and lows the way that he does. But this was good JR, if you will, for Howie this past weekend, I felt like. So I'm going to throw it to you, Chris. And again, winners and losers based on advancement and decline on the league landscape.
I think there are some Eagles fans that would like Howie to beat the third iteration of J.R. Smith and go play golf. But there are some teams that, again, I really liked what the Jets did. I thought they played hard. I mean, I have a lot of questions about Saleh as a coach, but I thought they played hard for him last year. And I think they added real talent that's going to help out this year in rounds 1 and 2. These guys are all going to start. Brees Hall, Johnson, Wilson, Gardner, they're all going to start. And so I think they help themselves a lot. Another team that I really liked, actually what they did was, I actually liked what Detroit, I did like what Detroit did. I thought that, they got guys that are going to start or at least immediately help out in terms of Hutchinson will start, Williams will start, Pascal will be a role guy this year, but they help themselves. I think Mitchell down the road, Virginia Tech tight end, the guy that could, help out down the road. So they got some future guys, and they got a couple guys that are going to be, right off the gate starters and could make that team better. I didn't really care for the Packers draft, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of guys there that just aren't going to make that team at all. So watch the waiver wires if you're other teams. Colts, I liked Alec Pierce. I know I expressed that beforehand. I think he's this year's Cooper Kupp potential. And so when they grabbed him at 53, I was like, that was a guy I really wanted us to get, the Browns. And obviously, Barry could have at 44, and he didn't like him. Another team that, and again, I thought great draft. How do you move up from the top by having a good draft? The Chiefs. I think the Chiefs, they really helped themselves and put some talent, back into the pipeline on that roster with McDuffie, Karlaftis, Sky Moore, Brian Cook, the safety out of Cincinnati. But they didn't move up the hierarchy, right? They just maintained. They had a solid draft that maintained. I agree with Jason. I don't know what the hell the Chargers are doing.
Right.
In years past, I have many times liked their drafts. This year, I went shaking my head going, I don't know what that was. I felt the same way about the Rams draft. I was like, okay.
Right.
I felt that way about the Raiders draft. There are a lot of teams where their draft, I was just like, just didn't move me. I'm going to make a bold statement, too, about the Patriots. They haven't drafted well in about 7 years.
Right.
And Robert Kraft has publicly bitched about, we got to get better at drafting. And I think that's a team that, based on this draft, brought in no starters that are going to help them right now. So I think that Kraft, don't be shocked, and I'm going to be the first to say it. Don't be shocked if this draft class provides nothing. And the Patriots were not a very good team last year that sort of backed their way into the playoffs. In the middle of that schedule last year, they went on a run because they were playing teams that were racked with injury or COVID or whatever, and they won a bunch of games, and then they lost a bunch of games going into the postseason. They looked like shit. They couldn't stop anybody. Their linebackers can't cover in space. They did not address that at all. Dean would have been a guy, I swear, or Lloyd. They would have grabbed and tried to address that problem. They're not going to improve that situation with a guy like Wilson that they traded for Browns, because he's not a good cover guy. He's a run guy. Another guy that Bill likes. Don't be shocked if they stumble out of the playoffs and kind of crash this year, and Kraft uses the failure of the season and another bad draft to clean house. And I know that will be shocking for people to say. But I think Robert Kraft now is seeing the fact that equation of is it Belichick or is it Brady? I think he knows now where a lot more of that credit needed to go to. And I wouldn't be shocked if he cleaned house after next year if they bomb out and it's not a good draft and they don't make the playoffs. Because I think Kraft won't hesitate to say, it's time to retire, Bill, and we're going to get rid of all your guys. I'm not making Matt Patricia the next head coach or your son or anything like that. And he's smart enough to look around at the McVays and these other young guys and say, that's the direction I need to go. So I'll be the first to say it. Don't be shocked if this draft in this season ends up being Bill's last.
I mean, that's one of the biggest clip and save predictions we've had on this show in a long time. We will be replaying this endlessly if that comes to pass. And I have to say, too, a follow-up on that, Chris, for any of the criticism in recent years, because, again, he had Nick Caserio in there doing stuff with him of, like, who's to blame for some of these drafts, him or Caserio. You look at the pretty good draft they had in Houston, along with another stinker in New England, and I think the answer to that is getting rapidly answered.
Well, I think Bill has fallen into the trap of thinking that he is Bill, and he's the smartest guy, and he goes and intentionally tries to find these guys that no one else believes in, 3 rounds before anyone else would draft them, because he's smarter than everybody else. And I'm sorry, I just don't think he is. I don't buy it. And so I think that Kraft is looking at this very critically. So we shall see.
If he loses his job to like some, 24-year-old kid with a faux hawk, I will laugh my ass off. That will be such great revenge for what happened in Cleveland in the 90s. But I have to say, before we're all done here, Jason, I got to hear you react to this prediction here. You got to have some thoughts on what we just heard. Or maybe not. It appears Jason might have dropped. Well, at any rate, again, I want to thank both.
Rick, I think that's what you called it. It was such a bold prediction, I left him speechless.
I think you did. And I was about to wrap this sucker up anyway. So, again, I want to thank both of you guys for being here, Jason Jones, Chris Galloway. Again, our draft coverage, preview, and review every year is always one of the very big highlights of the calendar year here on this show, and you just heard why once again. Can't wait for the next time of chopping it up with both of these guys talking football or individually doing so. But again, for Jason Jones and Chris Galloway, I'm Rick Morris. Thank you for joining us for this mini episode of the FDH Lounge.